Let's talk about the battle to brand Republicans as weird. I will say one thing that I think is getting missed in that conversation, because I was at the RNC and I heard Republicans talking a lot about how this was the election between crazy and normal. Someone, the three of us definitely know on the right is Terry Schilling, and he likes to say that all the time. This is an election between crazy and normal. So there's some of it happening definitely on both sides, but let's put the first element up on the screen for this block, please. This is John Harwood saying things JD Vance has said about people without kids: childless cat ladies, childless sociopaths, less mentally stable, most deranged, most psychotic, radical childless leaders, more sociopathic, driftless, childless Democrats must be stopped. We also have a shot here, a clip here that we're going to roll of JD Vance, and we will get everyone to respond on the back end of this. You can go ahead and roll the next element.
There's just these basic cadences of life that I think are really powerful and really, really valuable when you have kids in your life. And the fact that so many people, especially in America's leadership class, just don't have that in their lives, I worry that it makes people more sociopathic and ultimately our whole country a little bit less less mentally stable. And of course, you talk about going on Twitter. Final point I'll make is you go on Twitter, and almost always the people who are most deranged and most psychotic are people who don't have kids at home.
So Democrats obviously feel like this is fodder to make that weird label stick to Republicans. Tim Walz has been using it a lot. Kamala Harris now has been using it a lot as well. Now, I will start by saying on the right, the three of us, I would say, as compared to the general population, are politically weird. Ideologically, politically weird, because we're involved in conservative movement circles. And JD Vance was running in those circles before he decided to run for Senate. And before he converted to Catholicism. He worked in a super high profile job in the tech industry, converted to Catholicism, had a real ideological transformation that I think you two know as well as anyone, definitely is sincere. He was writing like 3,000 word essays for The Lamp about his Catholicism and his politics. That would be pretty difficult to totally fake. But is JD Vance, I'll start with, who do I want to pick here? Let's start with you, Inez, because you and Rachel may disagree on this. Is JD Vance going to help Democrats? Is he really giving fodder for Democrats to make this weird label stick?
Well, it depends on how he responds, and I think he should learn from the person on the top of the ticket, Trump, in this regard. I don't think there's a single pick that Trump could have made where they wouldn't have gone through every statement, like the media wouldn't have gone through every statement and try to pull out some things that, especially isolated from context, sound crazy. But I don't want to pretend to be a political consultant or someone who works on a campaign. I've always been, all the way back, Emily, since I've been doing these shows with you, I've always been really clear. I'm not a political consultant. I don't want to be. Only an insane person would hire me as a political consultant. So
everything
my question then is it true? Right? Are the underlying things that JD Vance is indicating or implying, are they true? And the answer largely is yes. If we set aside the question of how this plays or who's offended by it, we see a huge gap in voting patterns between essentially married men, married women, and unmarried men in one batch that are all between slightly leaning to 55, 56% leaning Republican, and then unmarried women, which, by the way, doesn't track perfectly with childless, obviously, but there's not that much polling on this. So and the unmarried women who are 68% leaning Democrat, right? So there is a real phenomenon going on here. And then to the psychotic comment, right, whether or not, again, that language is inflammatory, there's all kinds of surveys now showing that, and self-reported surveys, that liberal Democratic women who are not married report the highest level of mental illness, like themselves report the highest level of mental illness. So he's observing something I think is real. And frankly, I would flip this around and say we're talking about, we've been talking endlessly. I can't remember an election cycle that we weren't talking about the gap between male and female voters, right? That gap opened up in the 1980s. It was not there before. It used to go the other way. So in the 1950s, women voted more Republican leaning than men did. But that gap started opening up in the 80s. And I would actually argue that if you look at the underlying statistics, it's less driven by any particular messaging or issue and more driven by the fact that simply fewer and fewer people are getting married. And you see that that gap explode with Gen Z, where you see now like young men going further right and young women going further left. So I think there is something about marriage, about building families with the opposite sex, right? That tempers the political instincts of the two sexes. And I think we are probably about to see the most male-centric campaign versus the most female-centric campaign possible on the respective Republican and Democratic sides. Is going to heighten that. One final thing, we could just as easily be talking about a gap on the Democratic side among male voters, because in 2020, Joe Biden was able to get those numbers pretty close to 50-50. Now, Republicans still won men, but not by a huge margin. Kamala Harris is polling at 39% with men. So we could just as easily have this conversation. We could have pulled up AOC's tweet about incels, right? And we could have this conversation about incels and childless cat ladies and the problem that the Democratic Party has with men.
Yeah, but AOC is not on the ticket, is the thing. So the question
I'm just saying we could have the same political conversation.
But we've got white dudes for Kamala, so they're going to solve the problem.
No, but the principal on the Democratic side is polling very, very poorly with men. And we could have the same conversation about why that might be, or why some of her rhetoric might be alienating to men.
So you would be hard pressed to find, a mainstream Democrat, or certainly the Kamala or Joe Biden or the gents that are being considered for the ticket, who've said things that are so intentionally offensive. And the things that you're saying, Inez, I think, like, for example, I'm in favor of family, pro-family policy. I'm in favor of a child tax credit. I'm in favor of affordable childcare. I'm in favor of making it easier for people who want to have families to be able to have families. So the difference is, and Rachel, I'll get you in on this, how you talk about those things. And Matt Bruenig actually made an interesting point. I think part of the problem for JD Vance and how he messages in particular, which is very different from how Trump messages. In Trump's cleanup of this, he was like, he just likes families. He just likes families. He's not against anyone. He just likes families. But JD Vance did come up through these very ideological and often online spaces. And the rewards don't really come in those spaces from saying things that are broadly appealing. Like, for example, child tax credit has 70% support. They come, and I know this because this happens on the left too, from saying the things that are feel edgy, feel subversive. And so when you take those comments out of that context and you blast them out to a general election audience, suddenly you have a political messaging problem. Matt Bruenig made this point. I'd love to get your response to this, Rachel, because you're deeply plugged in, in the new right space. Problem JD Vance has is the same one Orrin Cass and Similar have. They want to break with GOP economic orthodoxy, but not in a way that is so palatable that the Dems are cool with it, which requires either making the policy actually suck or framing it in some way that piques the libs. And that's kind of what I get off of his comments is if he just goes out there and he's like, hey, we should have a child tax credit. Well, that's not exciting. That's not edgy. But if you say screw these childless sociopaths and these deranged ladies who are destroying the country and must be stopped at all costs, then you get online traction, you become a thing. So, what do you make of his comments and what do you make of that analysis?
Well, I actually think it breaks down into two categories, right? I think the family formation policy and how we talk about our politics being run by, white liberal women without kids are two separate things. And I think, to get to Inez's point about the latter point, he is correct. There was a Pew poll a couple of days ago that came out showing that I think among Gen Z, among young millennials, people aren't having kids in greater numbers. And the reason is that they just don't want them. Now, to pretend that's not going to change our politics, to pretend that's not going to change how our social culture is built is ridiculous, right? We have to be able to talk about that. And I think that the white women for Harris, that the woman who led that has kind of gone viral as a case in point of kind of what JD Vance is talking about, which is this sort of HR culture, whether you have kids or not, right? This HR culture that's built toward policing conformity. Helen Andrews at the American Conservative talks a lot about how women in groups act about this, right? They're different than men. Men will go out and create conflict around things. Women police conformity in very sort of passive aggressive ways. That is reflected in our politics. And I think that's kind of what he's talking about. Do you want people making policy in that vein, which is totally different in many ways of how people with kids view the world? People with kids tend to have a stake, more of a thought and a stake toward the future. They tend to have a little bit of a different perspective because they've got, financial concerns that are completely different than people without kids. Now, going to the second point about family formation policy, yes, the way you talk about that, I think, is a challenge. And Ross Douthat had an interesting Twitter thread about this the other day. The pronatalism space is inherently weird in itself, right? Being able to talk about it in a way that you're talking about something very personal and very, people have unique views on it. It's a difficult thing to talk about generally. And so it can come off as weird. And I think, someone like JD Vance, who's an elder millennial who has grown up in a lot of, who came of age, I think, in a lot of blue spaces.
Who has thoughts on Garden State. Yeah. Yeah,
right. Saying things that are, edgy and come off as subversive. To your point, that's, if you grow up if you come of age in a blue area, that's how you tend to talk about it. It's a very online way of speaking. He's going to have to change how he does that, because I think that doesn't fly, outside of these very niche Twitter spaces. So the foundational truth he's talking about, I think, is correct. But to your point, he's got a messaging problem that he's got to fix.
Yeah, it's got basket of deplorable vibes, where it's like, this is my personal view, train all the fire you want at the people who are setting policy, at, the financial, media. Yes. But his comments were not just about Kamala Harris, which, by the way, Kamala Harris is a stepmother, which, for a lot of people, they're looking at that and going, wait, you don't count stepmoms, you don't count stepdads who are, raising kids and doing the work as well. But in addition, it was a broad brush. And so there were many people who felt themselves condemned to, this characterization as being less mentally stable, most deranged, most psychotic, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's, to me, what it has echoes of, is the minute that you show contempt and judgment for a broad swath of the country, you're going to lose, both in terms of electorally, but also in terms of whatever it is that you're selling. And I don't actually think it is hard to talk about at least some family policy. Like I said, child tax credit has 70% support. It's very popular. Things like affordable childcare. And I know there are debates about, within the right, he wasn't a big fan of the idea of focusing on childcare, but the idea of making it easier for moms to be able to raise kids, for parents to be able to have families, I think those are broadly accepted and very popular. It's only when you go out of your way to frame it in this aggressive, negative way that it becomes unpopular. And for me, it's a problem, because I actually want those instincts on the right to be cultivated and be successful. So I'm cheering for the messaging on the right to be better and more appealing on those areas where, there is some genuine overlap that's starting to develop.
Well, this will likely be a lesson in that. Here, let me roll. Inez, I'll get you to respond to this clip that we're going to roll. This is a Fox News compilation of people being called, people calling, Kamala Harris calling Republicans, Trump, Vance, weird. Let's go ahead and roll this.
Well, it's just plain weird. I mean, that's the box you put that in, right?
It's not just a weird style that he brings. It's that this leads to weird policies.
That is weird behavior.
More extreme, more weird, more erratic.
I mean, on the other side, they're just weird.
The 32 ounces of weird.
Donald Trump and his weirdo running mate.
And by the way, they are weird.
It is bizarre. It's weird. It is weird.
JD Vance, just dumb Vance, is pretty weird.
So I actually want to agree with Krystal. I think it's very, very powerful, which is why you saw this sudden rush of it, and why you actually saw Republicans like Terry, for example, at the RNC using something similar. Here is F4. This is a tear sheet. This is from The Hill. Some House Republicans are slamming Trump's VP pick, quote, the worst choice. I've heard that from sources. I'm sure everyone's heard that now. So I'll just, with all of that said, toss it to you, Inez. JD Vance, a bad pick or not? If you were a Trump campaign advisor and you could wave a magic wand and replace him with someone else, is that the right move?
First of all, I told you nobody in their right mind would give me that magic wand. But to answer the question anyway, absolutely not. I think he was, if not the best among the choices, among the best of the choices. Part of that is what I said in the first part of the segment, that I don't really think that VP picks make that much difference electorally either way. And I think actually what Trump needs is a consigliere, a competent, bright consigliere who's actually going to run policy through the executive branch and who's aligned with his vision, which is very different than the establishment of the Republican Party. And that's what I think a lot of this is, by the way, the Republicans sniping at JD Vance as opposed to Democrats trying out messaging, which we're in an election, that makes sense, is just that JD Vance has some ideas that are very, very different, both domestically and on foreign policy, than the party establishment. And I think that's where a lot of this comes from. In terms of whether or not weird lands, I think it maybe did initially, and I think there is a large element of return to normalcy. I think Biden was very much able to tap into that in 2020. I think it's much harder after the last 3.5 years to tap into that adult in the room, sort of return to normalcy energy for the Democratic Party. There is a record that the last 3.5 years have not, if anything can be said about the last 3.5 years, it's not that they've been normal. So I think it's difficult, but I think that messaging generally is quite potent. I think this is way overused, and I think it's going to end up either burning itself out or being very easy to just throw back in Democrats' faces by pointing to a lot of weird examples on the left. And then finally, just one sentence about what we were talking about before in terms of how to talk about these issues. I agree completely with what Rachel said. I thought the same Ross Douthat tweet that she's pointing to, I thought was also interesting. These are personal issues, so it's very difficult to talk about them without, causing offense, even if you're very careful, which JD was not particularly careful in his phrasing. I also think there is an element in all of this of allowing ourselves to be ruled by the tyranny of, but I'm an exception, right? We can talk about general trends in society in such a way that, oftentimes, and this is not just on this subject, you talk about any kind of general trend in politics or in culture, and the first 10 replies, whether online or frankly in person, a lot of times are, but that doesn't apply to me. Well, if it doesn't apply to you, then perhaps we can still discuss the rule as opposed to the exception. And actually, I think this applies to so much of our discourse. We are constantly tiptoeing around the exception and therefore not discussing the rule, which I think is a deficit, not just in this conversation about how this major change in whether or not we replicate ourselves will affect our politics and civilization, but on so many issues where I guess I'm just tired of the chirp coming up every single time. Well, but there's exceptions, right? That's obviously true. There's no statement you can make that won't have exceptions.
This is exactly why you're not a consultant.
Rachel, 2 quick thoughts for you to respond to. First of all, with regard to weird, I have to tell you, I was asking myself last night, I was like, is this getting overused? But then I had to remind myself that we are weird. Normal people out there in politics, the rule is you repeat the shit out of whatever it is you hammer. And Trump is amazing at this, right? No one understands branding and repetition better than that man. Crooked Hillary, low energy Jeb, Lil Marco. We can still say it to this day. And it wasn't because he used it once. It's because he routine over and over and over again so that it's the first thing you associate with in your head. With regard to JD Vance, my just very quick, case for why he is a problem for the ticket at this point is because the 2 areas where the Trump campaign clearly feels vulnerability are abortion and Project 2025. JD Vance has said a lot of things that Trump does not embrace on abortion, and he has authored a forward for the Project 2025 guy, and is clearly aligned with the kind of beating heart of all of that. So on the 2 areas where Trump feels himself to be the most vulnerable, JD Vance brings additional baggage that he has to deal with and has to defend to the ticket.
So I think, I'd go back to something Inez says, which is Well, at first, I think to the point you made, yes. I think if you're repeating something to the point where you think you're saying it too much, you're probably just breaking through. And I think that's a maxim of political campaigns that Donald Trump, to your point, has been very good at. But I think on the second issue, I really, it goes back to this idea that whether or not JD Vance characterized it correctly, he is correct when he says that, the divide between parties are people that want to actively control every aspect of how you raise your family, what you do, how you talk, and everybody else. And I think his sort of childless cat lady comments are a proxy for that impulse in the Democratic Party. And I think the Democrat Party can continue to just say, JD Vance is the weird one, but there's going to be example after example after example on the left, particularly culturally, where they're going to pop up examples of crazy far left culture and say, oh, these are the people that want to tell you that, JD Vance is weird. And I think that divide is going to continue to present itself because, again, what he's saying, you can say it was artless, you can say it was classless, but it's a proxy for this impulse on the left to, control your speech, to control who, what you say at work, to control your, how you talk about your religious faith. These are things I do think will resonate. So,
but Rachel,
now,
if I could just, when you're judging people for when and how and whether they have kids, this is exactly why I think this framing is a problem for Republicans, because you're right. When it's Democrats who feel like they're policing how you live, what you can say, all of those sorts of things, Americans have this knee-jerk reaction against it. And I think that's why these comments are a problem, because they reflect a similar tendency on the right of there is one way for you to go about your life. We're going to judge you for it. Here's the program. And if you don't fit into our model, then you're a childless sociopath, less mentally stable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what you're identifying, that instinct against that, like, controlling, judgmental, like nanny state, cancel culture, whatever type of behavior that has come at times from Democrats. That's what comes across in these comments is I'm going to police you, your life, your bedroom, your choices, et cetera.
Yeah, I think in my interpretation of it, having like lived in these circles, is that it's an efficient proxy way for him to talk about that widened aperture, right? That we're both speaking about. So I do think he has to contextualize the way he talks about it, because they're hanging him on a throwaway, way of speaking about these things. I do think he has to widen that and contextualize how he talks about it if he's going to break through the caricature that they're trying to paint of him on the left. Because I do think whenever, to the point that you made earlier, whenever you speak about someone with contempt, it's dangerous, especially on the national ticket. And I think unless he's capable of, and I think he is, of explaining this impulse on the left that he's fighting against, it's going to be an issue.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.